Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you want more daily health education, be sure to follow us on Instagram, which is filled with health optimization how-tos, grocery shopping lists, guided breathwork posts, myth debunking, and so much more. You can find us at Wild Health MD on Instagram.
Hey Carl, how's it going, buddy?
Good, man. How are you?
I am doing excellent. I'm in Southern California enjoying some sunshine. Still working, but didn't work
Yeah,
last week, so
yeah.
it's all good.
Having some time off. You
Uh,
look like you've gotten some sun.
I've gotten some sun. I also I'm driving a rental car around with Colorado plates, so every time I go out to it, I think about you.
Oh, yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah, it's really
How
nice.
do you get a rental car in Southern California with Colorado plates? It's always, I guess,
Kismet.
somebody one way ticket this thing.
Yeah, return to a different location, a really
Yeah,
different location. Yeah, it's maybe the only car going from Colorado to California and not vice versa
yeah.
these
No,
days.
it's certainly if you ask anybody from Colorado, they will tell you that vehicles only go one way there.
So
But
true.
yeah,
The amount of California bias is so strong. Like as soon as you get into the Rockies and West, I remember when
oh,
we moved to Oregon, people were like, "Are you coming from California?" And we weren't. But
yeah.
Anne lived most of her life in California. We were like, "Oh, no, 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 we're not from California."
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, like I even growing up in Wyoming, like like even, 30 years ago, like when you talked about Colorado, there was like, they're just all from California, which like, I don't have anything against anybody from California, but certainly like when I grew up, like, oh, it's just, it's like California in the center and square, like, but Oregon, when I was living there, it was the same thing. Like, I was right next to the California border, but somehow that was different.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of,
Well, I think we should be clear.
yeah,
I love
yeah.
California.
I love it there.
I
It's
don't have
lovely.
anything against it.
So,
I love coming to.
some of my good friends live in California. I know lots of people from California.
All right, we're gonna get on topic. We're gonna get on
Yeah,
topic.
yeah, yeah.
So we've had a bunch of questions recently from some from listeners, some from patients, and many from friends and family around VO2 max.
Right.
It's something that's been in the athletic performance space forever. But if you weren't a serious athlete, a cyclist or somebody similar, like you probably didn't really know much about VO2 max unless you'd taken a physiology class or you were,
Right.
scientifically inclined. So let's just start with the, goals here today. I think give people an overview. We're not going to go into the details of VO2 max testing, and we're not going to necessarily go into specific numbers, but let's give a good broad overview so people feel like they know what people are talking about when they're talking about VO2 max.
Yeah, I mean, chances are most people have heard of VO2 max, but they maybe not familiar with what it actually means. So in short, it's the maximum amount of oxygen your body can utilize during exercise. So and specifically like intense exercise. Um, it's a key indicator for aerobic fitness and your endurance capacity. Higher VO2 max levels, excuse me, often correlate with better athletic performance, but we're also seeing this with longevity as well. So, higher VO2 max and sustain higher VO2 max when a better way of thinking of it is when your VO2 max falls off, your mortality rate increases. And that's part of the reason this is all VO2 max has been discussed in terms of athletic performance since, I don't know, since it was, first discovered or thought about. But it's now entered the space that, we work and talk in all the time around longevity, and measuring people's VO2 max has become important because it can be modifiable.
Yeah, so I think of VO2 max in sort of the same mental bucket as I think about HRV.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's going to change based on age. It is an indirect correlate of things like longevity and cardiovascular health.
Mhm.
There are ways you can improve it. And your absolute number may be a little bit more important for VO2 max than it is
Yeah.
for
That HRV.
HRV.
Yeah.
But otherwise, there's a bunch of similarities there. So factors determine a person's VO2 max?
Well, a lot. And so there's several things that influence VO2 max. It's your genetics, like whether or not you were, I don't know, your parents were Olympic athletes. There's a good chance that you then have a higher VO2 max. But your age and gender, but also your overall cardiovascular health and your training status. So you can modify with how much you're training and increase your VO2 max. So while your genetics play a role, training really significantly can enhance your individual VO2 max. And, like you said with HRV, this is relative, right? So yes, there is a difference. Like these people who have these very, very high VO2 maxes that are winning the Tour de France. I think when I think of a high VO2 max, I think of the Norwegian Nordic ski team. I think that's the highest ever measured VO2 max. But I think of these. You know what skimo is? Do you know what skimo is? Ski mountaineering. Like those guys, those folks are freaks. Like they have really high VO2 maxes and they can train at that level. But relative for most people, it's what you want to look at is relative to yourself and the improvement for yourself, right? And the things that you can do to modify. So you can't modify your age or your gender or training, but you can modify your training status and your overall cardiovascular health.
Gotcha. And, it comes to mind that, one of the other factors I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think weight plays a role in VO2 max as well, right? It's like liters per minute,
Yes.
but then you do divide by weight. So if you're a tiny person with, giant quads and like a tiny little cyclist upper body, like T-Rex upper body, your VO2 max is going to be higher because number one, your weight's lower, and number two, the way that we tend to test VO2 max is with a bike or a treadmill. Right. So you're really assessing the lower body strength. So if you had somebody who had an extra 20 pounds of, lean muscle on their upper body, that's probably not showing up on their VO2 max testing. And it may actually lower their VO2 max just because of the weight that you have added to the body overall.
Yeah, and some people I think the purists report it without the weight. They don't divide by weight, so it's milliliters per kilogram per minute. But some people will report it in liters per minute. So you'll hear numbers like a really good VO2, max of 5 liters, right? But oftentimes that's not how most people think of it. When they're comparing, trying to make it a relative VO2 max is per body weight. So that's milliliters per kilogram per minute. And so you'll hear I can't remember what the highest, recorded VO2 max. I think it was in the 80s or something like that.
Yeah, I think 80s is sort of freak territory.
Yeah, freak territory for sure.
VO2.
But if you're in the 70s, you're still
killing it.
You're still killing it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I can't change my age. I can't change my genetics. And let's pretend I'm not really focused on changing my overall weight. What I'm going to change is my overall cardiovascular health and my training. So let's talk about training. If I wanted to bump up my VO2 max, what's the best way to bump up my VO2 max with training?
So, my thought process around this, I had growing up, I think this, I was really into, running and especially into college. I think of it in terms of doing interval training, but with running, we'd think of fartleks. So, those, I don't know if you know what a fartlek is, but I think you probably do. But fartlek is sort of training that was developed in the 1930s out of Sweden, and it was the worst name for translated into English. It means speed play. So that these are runs where you're running, you sprint for 100 meters, and then you jog slowly for another 40, and then you do another 120 meters, and then you do a jog, and kind of that sort of training, the intervals a lot of people have done, and then tempo runs where you'll increase your tempo for a mile or two and increase your pace. But really, what a lot of people now think of, and when I was younger, I thought a lot about this, and high intensity interval training wasn't really discussed then. but even though you were doing it, you just didn't realize that that's what it was called, at least for me. And so these short bursts of intense exercise followed by periods of active recovery or complete recovery. That's the area where people think that people get the most gain in their VO2 max. So really kind of, I think of it as stressing the system and just to like stretching out I remember in anatomy and physiology in undergrad, somebody explained like you can stretch your VO2 max and kind of like expand the balloon or like, stretch your lungs as far as you can. Then you have the capacity to do that again. And so that's what I think of for high intensity interval training as the most robust way to improve your VO2 max.
Yeah, so you should be working out at, super high intensity. These are not like this is in contrast to say like, zone 2, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a prolonged conversational pace kind of work where you're below the lactic threshold with VO2 max training, you're really looking to tap straight into and above your lactic threshold, recover, and then do it again, recover, do it again. So that could be, I think of hill sprints as like the prototypical VO2 max training, right? Like sprint up a hill, jog down the hill, let your heart rate recover, sprint up the hill, jog down the hill, do that for 20 or 30 minutes. And that sounds, really painful and really good for your VO2 max, but definitely these are challenging workouts. So, outside of hill sprints, other specific exercises or activities that you'd recommend for patients in terms of getting a VO2 max training session in?
Yeah, I mean, I think of anything you can design. You can build this around strength training as well. You can do high intensity interval training with strength workouts. So you could, for example, do 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off of 8 rounds of, say, goblet squats, with heavier weight. And then you take a minute rest and do same thing for burpees or renegade rows where you're on the ground doing, rows with weights. And so you can structure it with weighted high intensity interval training and non-weighted. But then you also can change the interval. So you can change it as, like sprints, just say flat sprints. For example, you do 40 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and you're walking back and then you can invert those as well, where you're doing 10-second bursts or 20-second burst and 30 seconds off. So there's different ways to design this to stress the system that are all successful in different ways. And it depends on some of your goals, and we don't need to get into that. But if you're trying to do more, put on more muscle mass versus just work more on your cardiovascular fitness, that's where you have some play in the system of what those intervals look like.
And then we talked about weights. We talked about running in the sense of, flat or hill sprints, and then, cycling, rowing, swimming, all of those are going to be, multiple large muscle groups that you can get a really intense. I mean, you think about Tabata intervals and those being, traditionally done on a bicycle, right? I mean, as long as you're doing something where you can go all out and recruit a lot of large muscles, you're probably safe to pursue that as an interval training technique.
So I like to test the people instead of being on a traditional bike to do the assault bike, where they have to engage their upper body, and they're more successful if they're engaging their upper body, to make it as being a little bit more of an equalizer to for those who are the pure cyclist in the group. Because I don't know, maybe my brain is, because I'm not a pure cyclist, but I want to be a little bit of equalizer, even though it doesn't really matter. But you don't want the cyclist to be able to keep cheating the system with their massive legs and their tiny upper bodies. Yeah, I got you. All right. Trying to think what else. Recovery, right? I mean, we so sort of how much recovery or how important is recovery in improving your VO2 max? And then I think dovetailed onto that, how many sessions
should somebody be looking to do in a week for VO2 max training, right? I mean, we talk about zone two and,
Yeah.
trying to get 4 or 5 sessions in a week. I know that the answer is not 4 or 5 sessions of VO2
Yeah.
max training a week. But would love to hear your thoughts on sort of recovery and frequency.
Yeah, I think if you are, the way I think of it, if you are not recovering, then you're not giving your body the time to adapt and improve its efficiency. So if you're not getting that, even in an individual session, so people can talk about your lactate threshold and other things, but in an individual session while you're doing a high intensity interval workout, but more I think of recovery in more of terms of how long between stressing the system at that max. And if you are not adequately recovered, then you don't improve, you don't adapt. That it not only includes the time to rest, but it also includes that adequate sleep, some focus on nutrition to support the recovery process, adequate protein intake. All of those things play a role there. How many times in a week? I think this is highly variable. This is where, we pull in genetics and talk about this with people. We look at their recovery genetics. We look at their high intensity versus low intensity, their genetics around that and what their recovery could look like for them. There are people that I actually allow them to do 3-4 days a week of high intensity interval training. I have a lot of CrossFit people that are doing 5 days a week, are recovering. Their genetics support that. That's less common for me. And I want to hear what you say about this. But most people, there are people that I'm having them 1 to 2 days a hit on the other extreme. Most people I have in that kind of sweet spot where they're doing 2 to 3 days of high intensity interval training. Depending on what their genetics sort of look like, I will have them focus more on the strength side of high intensity interval training versus the cardiovascular side. And also, we're not just their genetics, but pulling in their goals and what they're wanting to achieve. So, for example, if I have somebody who has some more insulin resistance and I'm trying to put on muscle mass, I'm trying to focus, or they're trying to put on muscle mass, I'm trying to focus them more on their HIIT training, be more strength-based, where they're doing, using kettlebells and things like that. Versus people who are trying to improve their cardiovascular fitness and really focused on their VO2 max, but also other things that are training for a running event or whatever. I'm doing different things with them. But for most people, I'm sort of in that 2 to 3 day a week of high intensity interval training, but there's some play in the system there depending on people's genetics and goals. I don't know what you do, but.
No, I love that. I think it's really similar. I think the folks who are, there's this sort of sports specific aspect to this where if you're working on training VO2 max for somebody who is a competitive, ski mower or a competitive cyclist, obviously that's where you're going to be building most of your intervals in and having those workouts structured, or CrossFit's a great example. But I think 2 pushing to 3 is probably the sweet spot for most people, but I think that the marginal gains you get from 1 to 2 are pretty small. I think if you've got somebody doing, if you're new to this and you're thinking about incorporating some dedicated VO2 max training, I think if you put in 1 session a week, it is a huge improvement. You're going to see a significant improvement as compared to the improvement you'll see when you add a second session onto the training you're already doing once a week.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think one of the things, I don't know if you're, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there for you.
I got nothing else to say, Carl.
Okay. I think one of the things that I found to be powerful for people is actually testing their VO2 max and then retesting it. After as like a driver. I mean, this is a little harder. It's not like the real-time feedback you get with a continuous glucose monitor and changing behavior. But I'll tell you, when a lot of people, when they set out goals and you're able to actually really objectively measure that in a way that, you did this and then you get the results of improvement of your VO2 max, and they can see that, and then that becomes a real strong motivator for people.
100%. And the other side of that is that if you are using a bike, or you're using an assault bike, or you're using a rower, folks can see improvement just in the wattage they're putting out.
Yeah.
And they don't even need to be going back in for regular VO2 max
Yeah.
testing, which is sort of the more available, less expensive, poor man's, poor woman's VO2 max serial testing. Although I think, serial testing is a huge motivator, and I'm a fan as well. I think people will see improvements in a few weeks, and those improvements will be right on their, on their energy device, whether they've got one hooked up to their road bike or they're using a rower or a stationary bike. So that's another cool way to get people in the game and seeing that this is worthwhile. All right. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, longevity. Let's just touch on that real quick. So, VO2 max, yes, originally and still a fixture of conversations around athletic performance. What's the deal with VO2 max and longevity?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the way I've kind of thought about this. There are a few ways in which we think VO2 max can impact longevity. So we talked about your cardiovascular health, and how regular aerobic fitness, which we know all the health benefits of that. We know we think it's a surrogate for your metabolic health as well. That higher levels of VO2 max are indicative of a better metabolic health. Respiratory function as well, so this reflects the abilities of the lung to deliver oxygen to the bloodstream, and so we think there's a correlate there as well as then there's oxidative stress. So exercise stimulates the production of antioxidants, and that helps mitigate damaging effects of free radicals. We think that VO2 max is a surrogate for that. Then there's also this aspect that is harder to measure as much as just quality of life. So when people's VO2 max falls off, they're not able to function as good physically, and then they have the downstream effects on that. So they're not doing the things that they would normally do from a physical standpoint. That has cognitive effects, that has physical effects, and that's why when people hit this there's two big drop-offs in VO2 max. So in your 40s, there's usually typically a drop-off, and then there's usually a giant drop-off in people in their mid-70s that's we think is correlated with all these things, but also a quality of life decline.
All right. I think we should stop there. I think that's a lot of information on VO2 max. That's enough of a primer, I think, for anyone to feel like they can jump in on the conversation, and hopefully motivating for folks to incorporate some VO2 max training into their programming if they're not currently doing it. Appreciate you, Carl. That was rad.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
That's all for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you're looking for more, be sure to follow us on social at WildHealthMD, and head over to wildhealth.com or wildhealth.com/premium to become a patient and experience precision medicine for yourself.